Welcome. Saul, by the way, all these sessions are being recorded. It's not to put you on record. It's more for folks who, if they missed the tasting, they have something back and they can watch later. Don't worry, this all stays within the club. You're not being recorded on, you're not being put on record. So yeah, feel
I'm
comfortable.
not too worried, but appreciate it.
Okay. Uh, I'm gonna go over some few announcements before we get into the meat and um, bread and butter here. In case you haven't noticed, we got Saul himself, the winemaker here on the call. So just want to get into it quickly. But just a few announcements. You should have seen my email yesterday, but Case Club closes tomorrow. So if you are planning on participating in the Case Club from last month, so all the Lambrusco that we tasted, then get your orders in now. I'm going to close that at noon tomorrow. So this is the last call for your Case Cup orders. So get those in now. Besides that, I don't really have any announcements. There's, one thing. There is a possibility come the 26th, so the last tasting of this month, that I may need to move that tasting. I may move it to the Tuesday, the 25th. I may move it to the 27th on Thursday. So you may move to either Tuesday or the Thursday. If any of you have a very strong opinion about one of those days, let me know. But yeah, we're gonna have to move that on one of those days. I can't do it on that Wednesday. So just a heads up, but I'll let you know when that is, which day it's gonna move to. But besides that, don't really have anything else. But last but not least, 6 Foot Wine Club is committed to donating 1% of its gross revenue to an organization whose mission statement aligns with its values. And this month, being the Pride Month, I've chosen Gender Sexualities Alliance Network. The donation link is right there in the chat box. If you want to learn more about what they do, if you want to donate alongside 6 Foot Wine Club, then the links are right there. If you don't want to, that's totally fine too. But not that, if you're just joining us now, we're tasting this guy today. 2022 championship bottle, Lusty Little Crushes. Got like, I love this little label design, which I want to ask you about, Saul. But yeah, that's what we're tasting today. But if you're just joining us now, our format is a little different today. Normally, I will go through my normal spiel about the wine, the place, the person or the people who make it, and tasting it and all of that. But today, we actually have Saul, and I did not ask you this actually earlier. Am I pronouncing Muchnick? Am I pronouncing it
Yeah,
right?
you got it right, man.
All right.
It's a tricky one,
We
but
have Saul Muchnick, the winemaker and the owner of Championship Bottle here. Initially, I was gonna like read off all this bio and all of that stuff, but I figured it was gonna give off a lot of information that we're gonna go over anyway. So I figured we'll just jump right in. But before we get into the questions and all of that, I just want to give you the floor, Saul, if you want to say anything to the folks. But without further delay, folks, we have Saul Muchnick from Championship Bottle on the call. Welcome to the call, Saul.
oh, thanks. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know what what all information you normally do as introductory bits, but I will just say as a blanket statement, if anyone has questions or if I say things that are confusing or use technical terms or whatever, like feel free to interrupt me and let me know. There's always a fine line between accidentally wine-splaining people and also, being assuming that y'all are advanced sommeliers. If I go too far one way or the other, just put me in line. But yeah, I don't know. What do you want to know about this wine? So we make it in all right, I suppose I'll do the full winemaker spiel. Sorry, everybody. But yeah, so my name's Saul. My wife and I make a tiny amount of wine under the label called Championship Bottle. It's a bad high fidelity joke. And we started in 2018 for basically at like a couple hundred cases. I used to joke that we started the winery for the price of a used car, and then the used car market went crazy, and I feel like that makes us sound a lot more wealthy than we were. And yeah, we're definitely gonna have to get top 10 wines, because that's like it. So and to be fair, like I worked in wine shops a long time before we started a label, and High Fidelity is far and away the best movie ever made about working in a wine shop, even though it's set in a record store. And though we tried to be much nicer, I would say. But yeah, and we make mostly white wines, and this is almost as red as the wines we make get. And Lusty Little Crushes is a co-fermentation, a mixture of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, and they're both sort of harvested and
Oh, did we just lose him? I guess we did. Well, he's gonna come back, so we'll give him a second. But by the way, this is also very last minute kind of addition. Wasn't sure if he was gonna be able to make it, but we confirmed it like this afternoon. So he's jumping on very last minute. So here we are. You back, Saul? Yep, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was saying I can go days without anyone calling me, and invariably the one time that I'm using Zoom on my phone at the winery, someone will give me a ring. Anyway, so yeah, so this is a co-fermentation of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. So that means that they are rather than blending them after the fact, we harvest them together. They macerate on the skins like a red wine. But obviously Pinot Gris is not as darkly pigmented as Pinot Noir. And so when you ferment them together, you end up with something that is sort of like ambiguously red versus rosé, and kind of loosely inspired, I guess, taste-wise, kind of in that Beaujolais, Loire red, Northern Italy, places where they don't care about specific colors of wine so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think I briefly told you this on the call when we talked earlier today, but this month's theme is called a non-binary box, and it's all about these kind of wines that intentionally blur the categorical lines that you can't really tell. This is red, this is white, this is rosé. It's all idea of just kind of thinking about these restrictions, rigidity / limitations that like social construct, whether it be gender identity or wine categorization, all these things can have on us. And as soon as I thought about putting this box together, this exact wine was the first thing that came to my mind, because I thought, one, because I like the wine. I think it's actually a perfect thing to be drinking at this time of the year here in DC. But this is exactly the kind of stuff that kind of rocks people's, gets people thinking. Like you say, is this red? Is this white? Does it matter? Like if you say you worked at bottle shop many times, like if you were still working at a bottle shop, like where would you put this one? Would it go, what aisle would this go in?
I would have hated this wine from a merchandising perspective. And
yeah.
I fully that now it'd be like, this is the wine that you're like, all right, it goes in, you hope that your stores are organized geographically and you can kind of shove it in the Oregon section and then explain it to people one at a time, but not really have to categorize it. But man, if you had a store that was organized based on sort of, reds, whites, rosés, I would put it in the red wine section, because I drink it more like a red than a rosé. I'll drink it at cellar temperature or a little cool, but I won't chill it, though it's not bad that way. But yeah, I think we're gonna call it red. It is more fun to call it red, because then people get annoyed at you if you call it rosé. Then people don't really care one way or the other. But there are definitely people who are like, I can't believe this is not a red wine. How dare.
Love it. That's exactly kind of things that we're featuring here this month. So love that. But before we get into the wine and all of that, let's bring it back to you. And for those of you who haven't noticed, Saul's wearing a Baltimore Orioles hat, befittingly, because the man is one of our own. He's a man from Richmond, and he also worked here in DC for a bit. So let's take it all the way back. Saul, how did a kid from Richmond make his way up to DC and become the first employee of a green hat, and then and then somehow become a winemaker in Oregon? Tell us kind of a quick story.
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up in Richmond. Technically was born in DC. We moved to Richmond when I was 2, and I got hooked on wine at William and Mary. I was super into beer. Got like, I mean, I know a college student was into beer, but I was like into beer in a geeky way already. It was bad. I was that annoying kid, and was home brewing and got really into Belgian stuff and was bothering these guys at the only wine shop that you could walk to from campus about beer all the time. And obviously, like, a lot of people retire to Williamsburg, Virginia, because it has great golf or whatnot, and it's listed as like a good place to retire. And all these guys like retired there that worked at this wine shop, and then realized that they only could golf like 3 days a week without going out of their minds. And so they'd all like had interesting lives, and they started working in the wine shop mostly for the discount, I think, and they didn't know or care at all about craft beer in 2008. And yeah, so they at some point were like, look, you keep coming in here, you clearly care about this. We don't like having to stay until closing. You want to come in like 3 days a week and work like 3 hours at a time and close the shop and like run our one beer rack. So I did, and they were like, we'll give you a budget each week, don't go over the budget, and keep the shelves full. And I had to learn about wine. And I really liked it. And then I graduated, and a winemaker from Napa like rolled into town doing sales work and was like, do you want to work harvest? And I was like, what do you mean work harvest? He's like, yeah, like, people come to, like, we need a lot more labor, for 3 months of the year than we do the rest of the year. Like, people come and they work for the harvest, and then they leave. And this blew my mind. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, you can just like work in a winery and like get paid and leave. And so I worked harvest in Napa, and it was like the bug just like completely hit. And I'm like 22 or 23, and it was I don't know, probably a bad way to set the plan for the rest of your life, but we were kind of hooked there. And I followed my now wife to Nashville. She was in grad school. I worked at wine shops, and then some friends of mine called me and were like, hey, we're starting this distillery in DC. And there hasn't been a distillery here since Prohibition, and we need somebody who has sales experience and production experience, and you're the first and maybe only person we could think of. Do you want to do it? And it seemed like a good idea at the time, and so we moved back to DC, and I was employee number one and a tiny partner in Green Hat Gin, New Columbia Distillers, until 2016, when we moved out to Oregon, like with the express idea that we were going to start a kind of loosely Italian themed winery, very loosely Italian themed winery. And that started a few years later. And, we've grown from 200-ish cases to 700 cases, which is still not quite enough to quit the day job, but it's getting close. Yeah, here we are. I don't know if that's an appropriate bio. Everyone's
great. No, thanks for keeping it succinct. Sometimes, like, I ask the winemakers this question, and it like takes 45 minutes, like telling me a life story, which is great too. But so it seems like you have some experience with beer, and actually all of them: beer, wine, spirits, all of it on the production side as well as sales side. Was there something particular about wine that kind of pulled you in more than other two? Like, it sounds like you could have gone into any one of those three, but why?
I mean, once I got into wine, I'm sure y'all have seen this, just like it's infinite in a way. I mean, like, beer is wonderful and cool, and it's beer is maybe regimented is the wrong word, but the wine is both unique and specific to history and place and time in a way that like none of those other things are, right? Like, you can buy malted barley and make whiskey anywhere in the world. Like, if you theoretically wanted to, you could make bourbon style whiskey in Scotland, and yeah, it'll be different. It'll age differently, maybe depending on the warehouses you're using. But like, wine is just so hyper specific to the place that you're making it, and to the grapes that grow there, and to the cultural traditions that give rise to those grapes, and the historical factors that inform those cultural traditions. And it's like you start digging and you never stop, and it's just so richly complex. And also from a production perspective, the wine is totally unique in that it's very different from year to year. Each vintage is different, and it's a total, you have a plan and then you don't have a plan anymore once the weather happens, and you have to deal with it on the fly. Whereas both with distilling and brewing, it's a very iterative experience. You you're constantly tweaking, a recipe. And also from a practical perspective, if you work in a brewery, Monday you brew pale ale, Tuesday you brew IPA, Wednesday you brew IPA again, like Thursday you probably brew pale ale again, like Friday you brew your pilsner, and like maybe a couple days a week you get to be creative. And wine is a month or two of really intensive activity in harvest, and then it switches focus to sort of different work in the cellar or different work in the vineyard, and so the year feels broken up in a radically different way, that just sort of suits my personality a little bit more.
Amazing. I can totally tell just by talking to you or just listening to you talk about answer that question that you're one of those people who are like just super nerdy and geeky about it and go like mile deep and go down the rabbit hole, which is exactly the type of people that I enjoy having on the line call. So I love it. So you decided to move out there. You had a harvest experience in Napa. It was a Silverado, yeah?
Yeah, it was at Silverado. So we made like 100,000 cases of wine my first harvest. I mean,
Yeah.
It's so crazy because for those of you who, I don't know if anyone's been to Silverado, or I assume some of you have been to Napa, but like the scale of winemaking in Oregon is generally really different than the scale of winemaking in Northern California. So officially, Silverado at the time was a mid-sized winery, was what they always said. So like 50 to 150,000 cases of wine a year. And I can only think of a handful of producers in Oregon who are bigger than 50,000 cases. And so those are considered like giant producers. And I would say like most of my favorite wineries in Oregon make 5,000 cases, 3,000 cases a year. So it's literally an order of magnitude different, or more, but it was my first harvest. And so I didn't know any better. I had a blast. And like, I literally went 2 weeks and only filled barrels. It would be like, I'd go in and I'd do like 3 hours of filling barrels in the morning. And then like we'd break for lunch and I'd do pump overs on some fermentations and then fill barrels for another 3 hours. And that was 2 weeks of my life. And it was awesome. I was just like, this is so cool. Like, how do we run the barrel filler more efficiently? Like, at that speed, you're like timing things. You're trying not to spill wine and you're trying not to get fired because you've never done this before. And then it really wasn't until I worked harvest at a small winery and I was like, wow, this is I get to talk to the winemaker. This is a whole different thing. But I think it's nice to move in that direction for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So was there a mentor figure or like a mentor for you in terms of winemaking, or how did you actually like learn the technical side of it, or was it all just kind of all through working harvest, trial and error on your own? Like how did you get there?
Oh God. I mean, all of I guess it's all the things. I mean, so I kind of never stopped fermenting stuff. And to some degree, like all fermentation is similar in more ways than not in terms of how yeasts need nutrients or don't need nutrients and flaws that can develop. And especially in terms of sanitation, brewing sanitation puts winemaking to shame. And that has to do a lot with the chemical like beer is just a much more fragile beverage from a microbiological perspective. And so sort of that taught me a lot of good habits. But honestly, it was years and years and years of kind of thinking about wine and what made the wines I liked special, and what made them unique, and were there any sort of through lines with the winemakers that I really respected in various regions. And then you move to Oregon, and probably I'd say there are kind of two big people, Marcus Goodfellow from Goodfellow Family Cellars. I don't know if you know those wines, and then Vincent from Vincent Wine Company. And it's funny because they both have very different styles of making wine. Vincent loves to is almost entirely destemmed. Like, the wines are kind of soft and silky, and Marcus likes a lot of whole cluster fermentation and kind of stern, angular wines. But they've both been great resources. And, so much of winemaking is really just trying to figure out what exactly the expression of a particular grape in a particular place is, kind of loosely, and then working backwards from there and saying, all right, well, if I think Pinot Blanc ought to taste kind of sort of like this, then where does it need to be picked? Like in terms of its balance between sort of fruit development and acidity. And then, all right, if I'm picking it like that, what vessels does it need to be fermented in? Or like what characteristics of the site are we trying to play up or play down? And kind of adjusting techniques to that.
Oh, when we were talking for a while, you had mentioned that you kind of took some classes or like a formal course, but you were turned off by what they were teaching. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, yeah. He's calling me out. I took some. So when we moved out here, there's a technically community college in like South Salem, Oregon, like in the heart of the Willamette Valley, that has like a pretty good viticulture and enology program, and they've got like a 7-acre vineyard and like a pretty modern state-of-the-art winery, and the whole thing is like student run and student operated, and like people take classes in like cellar maintenance, and it turns out that what you're doing is paying like $2,000 to top barrels for free for 3 months of the year. But you know, when I was like, all right, I know a lot about wine. God, that sounds like an awful thing to say. I know a fair bit about. I mean, like the thing is, you never know. Like the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. Anyway, but like I had some ideas about wine, and I had some ideas and some knowledge about fermentation and basics of things. So I was like, but I should take a formal winemaking class, you know? And so I signed up for the enology, like intro to enology and intro to viticulture classes at Chemeketa. And it's funny, the viticulture program, awesome. It was taught by Jessica Cortell, who now farms like some of the best sites in Oregon. She works for like she farms Seven Springs for Rajpar and Sashi Mormon. She farms Antica Terra, like you know, like her very like organic focused, like holistic agriculture, and she taught great courses. But on the winemaking side of things, it was very much a like industrial winemaking 101. So, you know, you add yeast to the, you know, you add this, you have to add yeast because if you don't, the wild yeast might have your fermentation go bad. And because you're adding specific yeast, they have high nutrient demand. So you have to add nutrient. And then because you've added nutrient, you have to add this other thing because, you know, spoilage yeast will feed on leftover nutrient. And there was this whole rabbit hole of like, you know, solutions in search of a problem. And at the same time, some friends and I were making wine. Like we had made a full barrel of wine that we from grapes we had picked ourselves in his basement. And I'm sitting there thinking like, I have learned so much more from the barrel of wine that we're making in Daniel's basement than I am from this class. And so I was like, that's the last winemaking class I'm taking. I mean, it's funny. I thought there's a famous quote. I don't know if you know it. Serge Hochar, the guy from Musar. There's this legend. For those of you who don't know it, there's a legendary winery in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and the guy who ran it for years was a total character. And there's a quote emblazoned on a Paul Greco T-shirt somewhere that said, "No one taught me how to make children, and no one will teach me how to make wine." And it came to mind. Like grapes want to turn. Like you put grapes in a bucket, and you know, they will turn themselves into wine and they will later turn themselves into vinegar. So you got to time it right. But like, it's miraculous how little there is to winemaking sometimes. And then also how much there is to winemaking sometimes, but we'll do that. Like, so sotto voce. Yeah, but it's amazing. I don't know. Winemaking classes were just, kind of not a waste of time. I'm sure for many people, like if you're running one of those 50,000 case wineries and you're like making wine that has to be, you know, this very similar stylistically vintage to vintage, or it has to be, you know, zero risk because you have literal shareholders in the case of Willamette Valley Vineyards or whatever. Like, I'm sure it's good, but I don't know. It seems like a great way to learn how to make boring wine.
Yeah, yeah. Is there was there a moment in your life or in your career where you turned onto that kind of like a natural wine or wine making in a way? Was it just through your preference of your own flavors and the wines that you enjoyed? How'd you get turned on to it?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, and it's so funny, like, you know, the wines are definitely natural. I never think of them as like capital N natural wines.
Right.
And boy, man, that's a debate that always is fun. It's funny because like I'm the guy who like I feel like I have two sets of friends. I have friends who are like really into natural wine, and friends who are really into like classical wine, and I'm definitely the guy who always defends natural wine to the classicists.
Yeah.
And it's honestly, it was just like, you know, I like the Louis Dressner portfolio way back in 2009, 2010 was super influential in informing my palate. And for those of you who don't know, Joe Dressner was kind of a pioneer importer of French and Italian natural wines, and had a house in France, and really brought in a lot of vanguard producers who were making natural wine at a time when there was no like natural wine movement. It was just a bunch of random people making natural wine.
People
And
didn't
you know,
even call it natural wine back then.
yeah, and 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 honestly, it was you know, and you drink those wines, and you drink some of the wines that like Kermit brought in, like La Pierre Morgon was like a hugely influential wine for me, and it was one of the things that like I just kept realizing that a lot of the wines that I liked were made with organically farmed fruit. They were made with native yeasts. They were made with winemakers who really didn't like to do things in the cellar. You know, they weren't acidified. They weren't, you know, you know, people weren't using enzymes, you know, for color extraction. It was all like, I was like, I really like this wine. And then I'd read the tech sheet, you know, on the website or on the importer's website, and it would be like, yep, hand harvested, organically farmed, native. And it's just like, at some point you put two and two together and you're like, hey, all these wines that I like are really like kind of cut from the same cloth in terms of viticulture or vinicultural perspectives. And then you start looking for more wines that are made that way, and then it's like a super hardcore, you know, you're down the rabbit hole, and
Yep.
and you know, you go from there.
Yep. So speaking of which, are there particular regions, are there particular producers that inspire you these days or back then?
Oh man, a lot. I mean, I'm sure everybody here is probably in the same boat where like I drink really broadly. It's really, you know, it's hard. So much of the joy in wine to me is the sense of discovery and the sense of connection to places and cultures. And so the chance to try something new and exciting is like, it's like traveling to a new place. But yeah, I mean, I drink a lot of Italian wine. You know, I drink a lot of wine from, it's like from less cool regions of Italy. Like I don't drink a ton of Tuscan wine. You know, a lot of stuff from Friuli, which is kind of the official inspiration for Championship Bottle. Not that we're trying to make Italian wine in Oregon, but Oregon's got such a short viticultural history. And it's entirely, you know, it started basically in the 70s, in a practical sense, and it's always been with sort of a Burgundian lens. And I was like, wait, you know, it seems early to just sort of arbitrarily decide that we're Burgundy. And here we are. But yeah, so a lot of stuff from Friuli. I mean, I've always had a lot of Beaujolais. I've always drunk a lot of you know, wines from the Loire. I'm like weirdly a champion of like the Southern Rhone in its like better forms. I don't know. Like I don't know if everyone here realizes what a dramatically uncool statement that is in hip natural wine. But I feel like the Southern Rhone was like the epicenter for like overdone, hyper spoofy, like Parker bullshit. And I hate those wines for the record. But like as a result, I think like the cool kids of the wine world wrote the whole region off, and so like the people who are making kind of like gutsy, old school, soulful Southern Rhone wines kind of get thrown away in the trash. Yeah. But I say when I go to them, I'm like, yeah, I really dig like old school Cote de Rhone, and like, you know, the three people who still make Chateauneuf du Pape like how I like it. Yeah. People are like, who are you? Like, get out of here.
Classics are classics for a reason, you know?
Yeah, you know. I don't know. Maybe this is not as fun a statement. You know, for the crowd as it is for you, but
no, I mean we've had all those regions that you mentioned. We put a box around it each for a month, and a lot of what you were talking about is kind of things that we've talked about, like just the whole stylistic change due to Parker in Rhone, and you know, it's all the kind of satellite villages that are like super cool these days. You know, like Ardèche in Rome is like super cool. There's like a cool, I mean, that's like the cool kids hipster juice coming out of there. You know, now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. How did you end up in Oregon? Like in 2016, when you and your wife decided to move out of DC and settle somewhere to make wine, how did you land on Oregon, and how did you land on Willamette Valley?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting. I mean, it was a pretty straightforward process. I don't know, like, I mean, it wasn't that straightforward, but we kind of had a certain amount of savings that we were like, all right, we can blow if the whole thing goes out, out the window, we can lose this money and it'll really suck, but like, it won't cripple us forever. And we're like, all right, where can we afford to make wine in the US, right? And the answer is like not Napa and not Sonoma,
Yep.
and not Santa Barbara. Um, and so then you're like, all right, cool. So if you want to make wine in California, your options are basically like somewhere out in Lodi or the Amador foothills or something like that. And there's some really cool wine being made out there, and it is in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if anyone here has been out to Lodi or been out to like Amador City, but when like Amador, for example, I have a friend and she and her husband have a cool little estate, and it's like 30 minutes outside Amador City, which is like an hour and 20 minutes outside Sacramento. And so it's like a 2-hour drive to Sacramento, and that's the metropolis she's near. And I like art museums. I like movie theaters. I like cool restaurants. And we're just sort of like, all right, that's out. And so then it was like, all right, Washington, Oregon, the Finger Lakes. Those were like the three. And we went up to the Finger Lakes. I was like, I know it gets cold in the winter. Let's go. The distillery always closed for a week between Christmas and New Year's. And so like we drove up to Geneva in late December of 2015. And it was not that cold. It was like the highs were like 25, 26. And everyone was like so excited that it was warm. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't. That was that. And because there are wines in all these places that I was excited about. I feel like there were, Oregon. We can talk about. I'll talk about Oregon in a second, but like I don't mean to like throw any of these places under the bus or to say that like this was purely a pragmatic living decision though. But like there was to some degree an idea that like, all right, if we end up in Lodi, like you can make some really cool wines in Lodi. But yeah, and then Washington, a lot of the wineries are actually in suburban Seattle, and it seemed really weird to be like 3.5, 4 hours from the vineyards you were working with. And then if you wanted to live in Walla Walla, my wife was like, I don't know if I can find a job way out in Eastern Washington. Plus, a lot of those wines and a lot of the market for those wines were like very, especially at the time, more so at the time, like super high octane, super ripe. And it wasn't what interested me at the time. And so then it was like Oregon. We're like, all right, seems like it's the last thing on the list. And we flew out to Portland in April, and it was just like we had the perfect April week. And I don't know how many people here have been to Portland, but when the weather is nice in the Pacific Northwest, it's the greatest place in the world. Granted, that's a small window sometimes, especially in the spring. But Portland was awesome. And the Willamette Valley, like the winery is in sort of the Tenderloin, sort of the south part of the North Willamette Valley, and right near the Van Duzer corridor. And I'm only an hour from Portland, which is crazy. And it's funny because a lot of winemakers live in Portland, because it's a lot better to live in Portland where you can walk to things than to live in Dundee where there's nothing, and commute that way. But yeah, and so it was and Oregon also still offered. It's really one of the few places in the country still where a lot of the wineries are small scale and not just billionaire vanity projects.
Yeah.
And that might just seem like a random slag at like I'm not trying to just throw shade at billionaires, but from a practical perspective, if you want to make a tiny amount of wine, like say 5, 6, 7 barrels, if you're trying like a vanity winery does not want to rent space to somebody random to operate out of a corner of their winery. They don't need the cash. and it's just a pain, and it doesn't do anything for them. But Oregon still has enough people making small amounts of wine on kind of a much more modest economic scale where the rent I pay is actually useful. And so it's still a very kind of collaborative industry. Like the ego that maybe affects parts of Napa and Sonoma hasn't quite hit here fully yet, in terms of, I mean, it's a very collegial industry here. So it's I don't know, it's a wonderful place. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I've always found Oregon to be, it hasn't quite reached that kind of a economy scale, so to speak. And then I think the prices of wine kind of reflect that as well. But on the flip side of that is exactly what you're talking about, is that there's a lot more of these like experimentation, as well as these small boutique wineries that are just doing cool, different shit.
Yeah.
And a lot of these kind of more established. And it's funny to talk about, like even Napa and Sonoma. It's like, in a grand scale of, in the grand spectrum of wine world, it's still very, very young. You know what I mean? Like compared to Europe, like we've been making wine for a fraction of that. Yet, it is the most established kind of place in the country. And even then, there's just a lot of kind of rigidity and a lot more pushback than these kind of a small ad hoc kind of pull yourself up by the bootstrap innovative thinking that happens in Oregon. At least that's the way I feel about it. I don't know if you feel that way as a winemaker there, but
I mean, that very much reflects like my lived experience up here. The building I make wine in, it was like built originally as a prune drying facility in the 50s, and it's like, I mean, it's a glorified garage. It's corrugated, like the walls are like the outside of the walls is corrugated tin. It's a pretty basic poured concrete floor. But it's been a winery since like the 70s, and it's been like this series of wineries who all have started here and then have gotten bigger and have like left to start, move and start their own thing. So, most recently before it was Vincent and I, so I run space for Vincent Fritchie, Vincent Wine Company. It was Groshaw Cellars before that, and he got bigger and moved to a new facility. And it was Brooks Winery was here for 12, 15 years. And before that, it was Gary Caneo, I think, was here, Canis Feast. The first vintages of A to Z were actually made in this building. Well, it's unclear if it was actually A to Z, but Sam Tannehill, who ended up starting A to Z, started his like label here like way back in the day and made like a tiny amount of wine. But yeah, so like the idea that there's just this like small space that people can rent, that like it's something that does not exist in a lot of parts of the world in general, but also certainly in the wine world in the US. And it's and it's a young enough region that we're still figuring out cool sites. And that was super attractive. There are vineyards now that people in Portland or in the Oregon wine industry considered to be like top-notch grade A vineyards that were planted in the 80s and were just completely ignored in the 90s and even into the early 2000s, either because they were, the wrong people, so to speak, worked with the grapes from there, or because trends change in how we want wine to be made, or the farming got better, or whatever. Like, and so the idea that there's still real untapped potential and also sort of arbitrage opportunities, like if you're making wine in France or if you're making wine in Italy, at least within a region, people have had hundreds and hundreds of years to figure out, all right, this is the good site, this is the good for grapes. And so if you want grapes from that place, or if you want to buy land on that hill, it costs you money. And it's funny because I make Chardonnay from 40-year-old vines that are ungrafted, which would be in Europe would freak people out, like just like that you could get ungrafted vineyards. And that site like literally just was like bought, the whole Chardonnay block was harvested by like Ponzi for years and just like went into their Willamette Valley bottling. And like the parents were old school farmers, and they dealt with two clients. They sold the Pinot to Erath, Pinot and Pinot Gris to Erath, and they sold Chardonnay to Ponzi. And they loved it because it was like, all right, we just have to, like, two people come in, we pick the fruit, we truck it down the hill, that's it.
Yeah.
And the kids took over, and we're kind of looking around, and we're like, our neighbors all get significantly more per ton or per acre for their grapes than we do. And there other people are putting names on labels and are getting some prestige, and like, why haven't we gone down this road? And so that, it started selling to smaller producers, and the site's incredible. And now I'd say there are 5 of us who make really interesting Chardonnay from it. But in 1995, no one had heard of Dion Vineyard, and even in 2005, because it just disappeared into the void. And that's never happening in Europe, right? That's not even happening in Napa, right? It's the idea that you can have just a total gem of a vineyard that's sitting there waiting for someone to be like, oh yeah, that's really cool. It's maybe not totally unique to Oregon, but it's certainly a much bigger opportunity here than it is in other places.
Absolutely. Well, now we're talking about the facility, since you are actually at the facility, can you show us a little quick
all right
tour of where this wine is made?
Yeah, so this is so I'm in the winery now. This is the tasting room. So let's see if I can do this. So this is the glorious, glamorous facility that we're talking about right here. And I'm not lying. It's a garage with grapes in with barrels and a chiller unit in. And I'm basically the barrels that you see behind me with the red tape. So each of those is like 25 cases worth of wine. Year 1, goal is not to trip while walking backwards in the industrial facility. So year 1, we started with like roughly 6 of these. So yay, like this barrel times 6. And then we've grown to basically this aisle right here. I don't know. And so out the roll-up door, we have the press and the destemmer and things like that. So those are stored undercover, but outside because we need the space, and also because that's just a good place to store them, and they're pretty durable pieces of equipment. And then here's temperature controlled, and we're kind of all getting, this is an interesting time of the year. This facility is unheated, and so it often gets really cold in the winter, and like the cellar temperature drops down in the 40s. And so if you haven't finished fermentation in the fall, like for white wines that ferment in barrel, often they ferment a lot slower than reds, and so a lot of times fermentation will slow down or stop, which is like totally fine. I mean, it's not fine if you're trying to bottle wine like super early to get it on the market as fast as you can. Then it's really annoying. And like if you come in here in December, you'll see like a pile of barrels that aren't mine, with like a tarp over them and like a space heater or 2 underneath, trying to keep the sort of the tent at 60 degrees or so. But this time of year now, everything's kind of warming back up, and so the floor is definitely wet because I had to hose off a bunch of barrels that are sort of started of like either finishing malolactic fermentation or finishing primary or things like that, and your bungs will pop or things will overfill as the liquid expands. So it's sort of a fun time of the year to get a peek at the cellar.
Is there 2 other wineries that make wine in that same space with you, right?
Good question. Depends on how big we count the projects. So I make wine here, and I got to be careful not to drift too far into the winery because there's like a spot where I lose Wi-Fi but don't quite have cell signal. So if I disappear or freeze suddenly, that we've entered that. The joys of being out in the country where you're like, it's like the front half of the building there's no cell service, and the back half of the building there's no Wi-Fi. But yeah, so it's Vincent and myself, and then a tiny producer called Sunshine Effect. And then somebody made literally 2 barrels of wine here this year, who helped Vincent with harvest. And that's like a proud Oregon tradition, is I'm gonna work harvest for you and then trade my labor for cellar space. And so I guess technically there are 4 wineries here, and by that standard there have been as many as 6 producers working out of this building at one time since I've been here. But in
It
very
must get crazy during harvest time when everybody has the press, and then it's like, I don't know how many presses you guys have there, but like trying to figure out who
yeah.
gets the press.
Oh man, it's honestly it's not too bad. I mean, now because like the year with 6 was a little bit crazy. I think that was the high water mark of dear God, we can't let this keep going. And it's funny, there are a few like truly collective facilities in the valley that I know of that are 10, 12 wineries, and that is I know people who've made wine there, and it sounds like a nightmare. I've seen it; it's a nightmare. It's like roommates, right? Like one roommate is like fun and it's nice to have somebody hanging around, and then like a second roommate is like maybe positive, maybe negative, and then like basically beyond that, it's just a potential for chaos and problems. Yeah, it's a little. I mean, the at this point the scale involved. Vincent is bigger than is I don't know 4 times bigger than I am. Which sounds like a lot, but I really don't make much wine for the record. Or yeah. Anyway, so Vincent, is 4 times bigger than me, and then I'm next, and then basically after that, everybody's making just homeopathic amounts of wine, and so it's less crazy because oftentimes they are doing things. Either it's so quick, or it's like, all right, I have 1 press load of grapes to do, and then I'm like the 2 barrels of wine. That is a literal 1 ton press load of grapes. So it's an hour and a half, 2 hours. You're in and out of the press. Somebody else takes it. It's no big deal. I think the things that get crazy in negotiating is when you have like 4 or 5 producers and and everyone's like roughly the same size. That's when negotiations get tough. But here it's like Vincent is like, I have 6 tons or 7 tons of Pinot Noir coming in that day. Like I will try to not be doing other things in the winery that require a lot of winery equipment. And knock on wood, it works out. Like everybody here works with a pretty wide range of sites. So we have fruit coming in a lot during harvest. It's very like a significant number of the days are fruit days where things are being processed, either pressed or processed for red wine. But we have so far not had a whole lot of days where everybody's on top of each other.
Got it. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know we've been talking for a while. Let's break it up a bit, and then love to taste this wine. Just to kind of see what it is that I say this all the time, but I love tasting wines with the producers, winemakers themselves, because the way the winemakers taste wine in the way that I've been trained to taste wine as a sommelier, like we look for very different things in the wine. So yeah, I'm always curious about like the things that like you are focused on. It always teaches me a thing or two about something that I didn't think about. So let's taste the wine. And yeah, just kind of let me know about what you were kind of envisioning when you were making this wine, and what you taste and what you like about it, and what you thought was maybe like a little lacking or whatever. Your general just feel about it. Would love to taste through it with you.
Oh man, I like. All right, I'm just.
Maybe that's not a fair question. That's like me asking you to like judge your child. Like tell me the best thing about your child and the worst thing about your child.
Oh, but don't we know it?
Yeah.
It's so funny. Like, thankfully, this is the wine that I've been very like happy with. It's funny because there are definitely wines that are just like such a pain to make, and they turn out really well. But it's like you can never free yourself from the trauma of the fermentation process. And so people are like, I love it. And you're like, I hate this wine. I wish it would disappear from the warehouse. I never want to think about those 7 days again. This one was actually pretty charmed. Yeah, I mean, the goal with this wine was always like, I mean, frankly, was just like, I like drinking this style of wine. I don't think enough people make this style of red wine. And part of it is just like, I tend to drink wine with food more than not with food. And by more than, I mean like 90% of the wine I drink is with meals, probably. And at least at our house, we don't really eat red meat much. And honestly, we don't even we're pretty pescatarian at home. And it's not a political statement, just to sort of how things have worked out. And I cook with a lot of acid and like a lot of lemon juice and a lot of herbs and a lot of brightness in is what I want in food, and oftentimes some heat. And it is tough when you want red wine to find red wine that goes with those flavors. And so having a red wine that has kind of the juicy brightness, the kind of super gulp, the gulpability, the things that's like, all right, there's not a lot of tannin to get in the way of if food's got some chilies in it, or if when you have a lot of acid in food, obviously that makes wines can seem softer, and so you don't want it to seem flabby, and the combination of all the things is just like, for personal consumption, I need a wine like this kind of around the house a lot. And it's funny, like the first couple of years of the winery, the wine budget was the winery. Like it was the wine budget, the personal wine budget got cut pretty hard for obvious reasons. Every now and then people are like, oh, what's, like when I was still working at the shop and also making wine, people are like, oh, what's the wine you have the most of at home? And you're like, well, I got 40 cases of broken radios in the warehouse. Oh, what does soft mean? So that's a good question. I feel like I should just take the easy way out and let the sommelier answer this question. But
way to dump it onto me.
Earl, I'm Harry. You talk to him every month, or every week. How often are these things? I know the clubs are every week. Man, awesome. Yeah. So I think of soft as being a condition of lacking a certain amount of freshness or a certain amount of structure. Man, structure, this is one of those, like, I'm using technical terms to define a technical term. It's like a non-definition definition. Like, I think of a wine from a sort of an architectural perspective as you have fruitiness, and fruit's delicious, but also the same way that like a tomato is better with salt and sometimes a little acid, you need kind of supporting elements of the wine to really make the kind of core elements of the wine, like fruit or minerality or whatever the flavors are, really pop and really work with food. And so in red wines that can be tannin, you'll hear winemakers talk and sommeliers talk about structure in wine, and really what we're talking about is tannin and acid and the way that those interplay, right? And tannin's the astringency in the wine that kind of scrapes your palate clean, and then acidity is like the tartness or the brightness that makes the wine kind of pop at the end of the palate. And to me, when a wine is too soft, it is like a thing. It's like too sweet, when orange juice is too sweet and not fresh. And you're like, all right, you have all this fruit, taste, the sort of sweet fruited flavor, and then it finishes and it kind of dies. And you don't feel refreshed after drinking it. And so that's what I'm trying to avoid. How did I do?
That makes sense to me. I also was gonna add, like, in terms of, because you mentioned Raja Par earlier. He's one of my big professional influences, and then one of the things he's ever told me that stuck with me forever is always think of wine, particularly acid, in terms of shape. Like, is it a triangle? Is it a circle? Is it a round? So to me, softer wines tend to have much rounded edges rather than like sharp angular edges. And that has a lot to do with the texture of the wine. But it also has to do with the acid, how much malolactic fermentation it's gone through, and all those things. But
yeah, and like obviously it's funny. I think of, man, a friend of mine jokes that a winemaker is only as good as his metaphors, and
that's good.
And it's gotten funnier the more I've made wine. But sometimes I think about furniture making and sort of craft, like it's sort of an analogous craft to winemaking, which maybe sounds weird, but in the sense that there is both a practical function and sort of a purely aesthetic function. And if you think about a chair in terms of like literal softness, right? Like you would think, oh, soft is good, but all of us have sat in chairs that are too soft, right? And they kind of become formless, and then they become And like maybe soft wines like soft chairs, at first you're like, this is great. This is comfy. And then at some point you're like, all right, I am fighting to stay upright in this beanbag of a wine, so to speak. We're gonna mix the metaphors. Yeah. And I feel like there is that component to it as well. Where like
that's fucking brilliant, Saul. Like I've never heard it put that way, but I'm gonna be stealing that from you, just so you know. I will give you the credit. I will give you the contract.
Just steal it. Yeah, but it's talking about wine is just one of those really impossible things, right? I mean, like one of the things that always like struck me really early on when I worked in wine, like I was the guy, I was left alone in a wine shop that had like physical copies of Wine Spectator and Parker and all these things, and so I would like be the person who's like, well, I could do homework right now, or I could read the Wine Advocate cover to cover and just like devour these tasting notes and which is still, I'm like, oh God, what was I like? Anyway, it's like borderline sociopathy. Anyway, but one of the things that was funny to me is that like you'd have two reviews of the same wine from different publications. And obviously they both could think that it was qualitatively different. And I understood that. But what was fascinating to me is like you'd read the sort of lists of flavors that they'd use to describe the wine. And oftentimes it didn't sound like they were talking about the same wine at all. And these are like people who taste literally thousands of wines a year and are like professional tasters. And I was like, all right, well, if we can't agree if a wine tastes like raspberries versus tastes like, I don't know, cherries, or if somebody's like, if these two ostensible professionals can't even tell me what the wine tastes like, then like we have to like I have to think of wine in a very different non-fruit salady way. And so you end up with like, all right, well, it has to be metaphors, I guess, because talking about it in a literal sense is really tough.
Yeah. Say also for you folks who've been with me for a while, I've been saying this for the longest time. Actually identifying the actual fruit when we're tasting through the wine is the least important part of all this. Is it strawberry versus is it cherry? Like none of that really it matters all that much in terms of actually analyzing the wine. So it's not just me. You heard it from Saul too. So
oh God, it's funny. I said that and I'm like, oh, this is either going to get really ugly or. So for those of you who aren't in on like sommelier politics, there is definitely a school of thought of certain kinds of people who work in the wine profession, and it is like this wine tastes like black cherries and cola and sassafras and this other thing, and like therefore it is this wine when we're tasting blind, and like I only care about the specific flavors of I identifying, and I tend to be very annoyed by those people and also to annoy those people. So I was like, all right, let's see where we go.
Yeah. I'm not one of those people, in case you have no wondering.
But, yeah, we figured, because otherwise the room, so to speak, would have gotten a really really fun exchange.
Love it. I was actually always curious. Was the choice of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, was it intentional, or was it kind of like what you? Speaking of analogies, you made this analogy when when we're talking earlier. How winemaking is kind of like cooking, where like you first have to go to the market and you find the best fish or best piece of ingredient you can find, and then you go from there. You kind of have an idea of what you want to make, but until you find the main ingredient, you don't really know what you're going to make, and you go from there. So was it kind of like, were you just you had this idea of co-fermenting red and white grapes together, and then Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris became available, or were you set on Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris? Like, was a particular vision for them?
Oh man, so it's a good question, and I see the question about pairing wine in the chat, and we'll get to it in a second, I guess. But because otherwise I'm Captain Tangent, and we'll never get back to this, because I do think it's like there. So I wanted to make a light red wine, and I had made some. There are a few people who've made some like 100% skin contact Pinot Gris, and honestly, it turns out to be a very similar color than this. But when you're making 100% Pinot Gris as a red wine, Pinot Gris often has pretty hard tannins because it was bred over the centuries to be a white grape, and so the sort of qualities that monks mostly were selecting the grapes for had more to do with yields and aromatic qualities and things like that. And because they were going to press it off as white grapes, since you didn't have to worry about how tannic it was. And so as a result, Pinot Gris is a tannic son of a bitch. And so you have to really like be careful. And oddly, Pinot Noir oftentimes is like is pretty, maybe not oddly, but Pinot Noir is low in tannins and silky. And so if you combine the two, you still don't get a lot of color, but you get a wine that's a lot more approachable. And the other option, if you want to make a light red in the Willamette Valley, at least, is to make it out of Pinot Noir, which is appealing in theory. But I didn't want this wine to be expensive or like, and Pinot Noir is a really tough grape to make inexpensively here. And that has a lot to do with, I mean, I don't know how apologies to the room if this is overkill, if you've heard it before, but Pinot is a very finicky grape. Like the clusters, the grapes are like super tightly bunched together, so it's really susceptible to things like rot and mildew, because if it gets wet, the moisture doesn't have a good way to escape, and so you have to be really careful and do a lot of handwork in terms of making sure there's lots of airflow in and around the clusters. Also, the clusters are small, so yields are low. And adding to that, like yields are often very inconsistent because we get really crappy weather in June, which is when the plants flower. And so if you get rain during flowering, then you have a lot less pollination, and so a lot less fruit sets, and your yields are low. And all of it, but because it requires a ton of labor one way or the other, the sort of costs to farm it are always going to be high. And so when you add all that up, it means it's an expensive grape. And so if you're making a wine in the sort of sub $30 price point from Pinot Noir historically in Oregon, there is a compromise baked into it in a real way. Somewhere, a lot of people, I always think of like that price point for a lot of wineries is sort of the charcuterie board of the winery, where it's like you're taking a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and maybe it's like a barrel, like you're taking some press wine, or maybe your less good barrel from here and sort of discreetly blending it in. And, some people will buy less interesting fruit for their inexpensive Pinot. And like, do you have enough interesting barrels to kind of round it out? And obviously, like charcuterie, there's great charcuterie and there's really not great charcuterie. But I didn't want to have to be like, to just do that. And Pinot Gris is significantly less expensive. And so I was like, all right, I can get Pinot Gris from a really good site and get Pinot Noir from the same site, or in this case, a site not too far down the road. And so I don't have to compromise on the quality of the vineyard, and we can make this wine, and it, like, from the cost of goods perspective, I don't have to make it a $30 bottle or a $35 bottle.
Yeah.
Where, and anyway, yeah, so that's the long and the short of that. I feel like that's not a terribly glamorous answer. Like, I wanted to keep it.
That's a great answer. Yeah. I always wonder with these kind of quote unquote experimental or non-conventional kind of wines, how much of it is just kind of what was available, how much of it was actually like a architectural plan was there before,
so it was a little column A, column B. I mean, like,
yeah.
And I had made a mostly like a 90% skin contact Pinot Gris as a air quotes home wine. I mean, like, I bought a half ton we made a full barrel of wine in a basement, a couple years. And it was one of those things that, like, like, I got lucky with tannin management, and that wine turned out really well. But also it was like, when you making home wine sounds great. You're like, you and some friends go in on a barrel of wine, and honestly the costs are not that bad. And all of a sudden, June rolls around and you bottle 25 cases of this wine, and you split it up, and there are 6 of you maybe, and so each of you gets 4-ish cases of wine, and you're like, wow, this is great. I have this wine that didn't cost me that much. And then you're like, I have 4 cases of the same wine. I never drink a case of the same wine. But it turned out that, like, it was just, like, super useful at the table. You were like, I don't know what to drink. Let's pop we called it controversy. an homage to the Prince song of the same name. And like, because is it a black or white grape? Anyway, that's the lyrics in the song. But anyway, so we were like, all right, this is it. Just like it ended up being great, and obviously enough that we were like, all right, we got to make something kind of controversy-ish later down the road.
Yeah, I think I know we talked about tasting this wine for a little bit, but for me, so I taste this in preparation for what I call wine prom. It's an event that I threw in April. It's like a once a year, our kind of in-person event where we all get dressed up and we go to a wine prom and we drink, unnecessarily large amounts of wine and make brilliant decisions together and all of that stuff. And then we eat food. Yeah, and then this was one of the wines that I actually had at wine prom, and because I had this wide ranging of, I also did Korean barbecue for dinner, so there's just like all these wide ranging flavor profiles of food that was there, and I was trying to figure out a wine that was going to work, that was kind of red, that could also work, but then I had some light wines already, but then I tasted this, I'm like, this is perfect, like this is so versatile in terms of its ability to play with so many different kinds of food that this is going to be great. And to tell you the truth, this was the most requested, because I also the next month I sold some of the wines that were that I featured in the wine club, and this was the most requested wines by the people who attended wine prom. So
awesome.
To give you an idea of how popular, how well this wine play with different kinds of food, and it just, I don't know, there are many wines that just kind of, even beyond just flavors, it just is the feel of it. Like there's a brightness about it, there's a levity, it makes you feel happy and energetic, and like this is exactly that. So
yeah, I mean, that's the goal. It's funny, like I'm never happy with the wines until like 3 years later. Just like all I can see is ways that I could have done better. I'm like, oh, yes, it's a trying to work through it. We're trying to be like more generous to ourselves on the winemaking front, but whatever, it's fine. It's working okay. But this is like a wine. But I can tell some of the wines. It's really funny. Like we'll bottle it. Wait a month for the bottle shock to set in, or to get set in and then leave. And you'll pop a bottle, and my wife and I'll sit down to dinner and we'll drink it, and I'll complain about it the whole time, and I'll be like, "Where did the bottle go? Like, oh my god, we emptied that quick." And that's normally when I know that, like, all right, I did okay with this one. Where it's like I'm like, oh, it's to this, it's to that. Oh, where'd it go? Anyway, but this is probably like a good segue into the chat question about how to, like, in terms of best advice for thinking about pairing wine for food. And I feel like you're the literal professional wine and food pairer, so this is like right up your alley.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone through this, and Hazel has heard me go about it a while. I mean, there are certain kind of rules that play out, general guideline or rule of thumb, so to speak. Like tannin works well with the protein. Match acid with acid. Make sure if you're going to do sweet, the wine is sweeter than the dessert, the food itself. You can have this kind of theory of contrast or complement, where you can play on the similar flavor and build it more, or you can try to cut richness through with the acid, so the contrasting flavor. So there's these kind of guidelines that play around with match the body of the wine with the body of the food. But more than anything, it's really figuring out how to not make the wine clash with the food. If it doesn't clash, you are already like more than halfway there.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah, after that, you play with a lot of different parts, and also the sauce is really important. A lot of people think a lot about just like the main ingredient, like is this fish, is this meat, and whatnot, but how that particular protein or the ingredient gets sauced or different components of the dish makes a huge difference. So there's a lot of science, but there's also a lot of art to it as well, as winemaking is as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Sorry, Hazel, I just like teed him up for you to listen to again, apparently.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I'm with you 100%. I feel like it's so funny because I feel like sometimes, obviously, when you're in like a really fine dining restaurant and the sommelier has like a really thorough knowledge of the menu and can be like, I've had this dish, every day for the last week, and I know it's going to be perfect with it. Like, then I've had some really incredible pairings that way. But it's
Yeah.
funny at home. I don't want to say it's random, but like I think that like first do no harm rule is like the greatest one, and then like sometimes things work in unexpected ways, and sometimes you're like, huh, the wine's fine, the food's good. They both like I enjoy taking a sip of wine, and then like that's good enough for tonight. Uh, but yeah, I don't know. Like it's I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, and it's also like a iterative thing. Like, people think sommeliers, we have this thing down. Like we have this conceptual model down, and we can usually have a good idea of what's not gonna clash. We can at least make the wines not clash. But to
Yeah,
really get the pairing right, it only happens because we have like iterations after iterations after iterations. We tried the dish so many times, we tried it with so many different wines. We can kind of figure out what works and what doesn't, and then we'll kind of move it in a way that make it work. But like to get it right at the very like first wine that like I see the menu without even tasting it, but like this one is gonna work. Like that's it's nearly impossible. So I'll say that. Well, Ryan, I know I want to be, I don't know, we haven't talked about how much time you have today, but it is 9:46. So in case you do have to go, I want to be
Oh,
respectful of your time.
I mean, I can hang around for, I don't know how long do these things normally last?
I mean, we
Um,
can go on till whenever we want to go home. We hang
um,
out.
yeah, I can hang out for a little longer.
Okay.
Um, Clearly, I hate talking about wine. It's a real problem. Uh,
Well, we'll open up the floor for questions just in a second, but I do want to ask just a couple more questions. Uh, One was, so now that, we've talked about your background, you worked in retail shops, you got into beer, you were a wine nerd in college, and then you worked Harvest, and then you worked at Green Hat, and you moved to Oregon, and then you in 2016. I think your first commercial vintage was 2018. Is that right?
yeah, 2018.
2018. So 6 years later, here you are still making wine in Willamette Valley, living the dream. Now, where is Championship Bottle in 5 years to 10 years? Where's Saul Machnik in 5 to 10 years? So what do you hope to do in Oregon?
Oh man,
Or
that
maybe
is
not in Oregon. I don't know.
no, we're staying in Oregon. I'm like it's Oregon, the cool part about being in Oregon is that there's a lot of history yet to write. And I feel like it's I mean, I think about like Oregon Chardonnay in the last decade alone, right? In 2014, I think was like 2010, 2011 was really when like modern Oregon Chardonnay production started to really kick into high qualitative gear. And I mean, at least when I moved here, people were excited locally about Chardonnay. And then I feel like a year or two, like, but like, and you talk to winemakers and they were like, oh yeah, we might be more excited about Chardonnay in Oregon than we are about Pinot. And I think that sentiment has definitely crystallized. And it's, but it's crazy because if you had talked to somebody in 98 about, or 2000 about Oregon Chardonnay being the future grape of the state, they would have laughed.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I mean, like the sort of early experiments for Chardonnay were not great. And conversely, grapes like Pinot Gris in the 80s was seen as the prestige grape, white grape of the Willamette Valley. And now, Pinot Gris is really super out of vogue. And I wonder if like Pinot Gris will make a comeback. Hint, we're trying. But it's it seems crazy that the landscape has shifted so much so quickly. And in terms of like 5 or 10 years, it'd be nice if the winery could pay me a salary at some point. that's like a sort of hopefully achievable short-term goal. Though it's funny, like I used to, on a side note, it's like I used to be really like I want to scale the winery and like quit the day job and have the winery be the full-time thing. And then 2020 hit, and for those of you who don't know, 2020 there were just horrible wildfires in the Willamette Valley, and we had a ton of smoke, and it made winemaking really challenging. And I only made 180 cases that year. And we paid all of our growers, and some of it was that yields were really terrible. And so I actually had a grower drop me because I was like the small fish on the totem pole. And so they called me literally a week before the wildfires hit. And they're like, we don't have any grapes for you. And I just started looking for more grapes when the fires hit. And I was like, maybe this is not the year to take on a new vineyard. But also just like having a day job, I realized I was like, oh my God, I can make decisions that are like purely based on winemaking and have nothing that are not completely divorced, but nearly completely divorced from economics in a way that like peers of mine who were, at 2,000 cases and paying their mortgage at the winery couldn't. So I used to be like, oh man, we're going to quit the day job, but it would be nice if the winery did pay me something. And then, yeah, I mean, like in 10, 20 years, like hopefully maybe we'll have our own facility and some young upstart winemaker will be renting a space out of my cellar somewhere.
Do you want to grow your own vineyards, or do you always want to buy fruit?
I mean, the financial aspect of planting a vineyard does not seem appealing to me. I mean, for those of you who don't know, like to plant a new site, like you buy the land, which is not cheap. You spend tens of thousands of dollars preparing it and planting the grapes, and then you have to farm it for 3 years before you get any grapes off of it all. And really, it's like 5 or 6 before you get like high quality fruit. Well, I shouldn't say that. There have been some really legendary wines made off of some pretty young vines, but historically. So it's like a lot of money up front before you start seeing returns and so from that perspective, I'm like, I don't want to own a vineyard. It seems like, but also what we've seen pretty consistently with this winery is that because we work with, we'll say, less sexy grapes on a market scale, from ideally really good sites. Like I'm trying to find cool vineyards that are planted to things that are not just Pinot Noir and work with the other stuff. And yeah, and so we've had like 4 different vineyards that have had stuff that I was getting grapes from ripped out and planted to Pinot Noir because the vineyard changed ownership, or because someone looked at the balance sheet and said, hey, we can make $75 Pinot out of this land instead of selling Pinot Gris or Rivola or whatever. And so we might, I don't want to say need to figure out a way to find a vineyard. I need to either find somebody who's crazy enough to like really commit to some oddball grapes for a long-term future or something else. But we'll see what's in the cards.
All right. Well, I always like to wrap up these sessions with some quick fire questions, Saul.
Yeah.
If you're up for it. So these are the questions I always ask every winemaker, every guest speaker that comes on. But if there was a metaphorical billboard where millions of people drive by it every day and see it every day, what picture, what message, what would you put on there?
Oh God. It's a good question. I mean, I feel like if there's a thing we do overarchingly, it is probably making kind of air quotes serious wines out of less serious grapes, and then not taking them seriously once we market them. But I don't know how to put that in the billboard.
I think you just said it right there.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your gateway wine? What would your epiphany wine? And what is the wine that you take with you to a deserted island, where chilling the wine is possible?
All right.
Any goddamn sense, but
oh, don't worry. I'm familiar with the rules of desert island wine game.
Yes.
Yeah. So epiphany wine, pretty early on working in the wine shop, I had a rep stop by and he poured me a white Burgundy it was a Clos de Mouche Blanc,
Okay.
but not the Drouin one. It's oh god, I should remember the producer. They own like a row of Clos de Mouche. It's a vineyard in Burgundy, in Beaune. That's like kind of a famous vineyard for those, for some people, but it's like mostly owned by one person, and except for in this case. And I'd like never had fancy white Burgundy before, and it blew my mind. I was like, oh my god, I didn't realize white wine could be like this. I didn't know like wine could be like that. So yeah, that's the Epiphany wine. There was the Desert Island wine. What was the middle one?
Gateway wine.
Gateway wine. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's probably La Pierre Morgan.
Okay.
Because both just the way that it combines seriousness and deliciousness and flavor without weight and everything. It was just like, oh yeah, this is a really cool wine. And at the time it was relatively affordable and gettable.
Yeah.
And so you could drink it a lot and you could watch the wine change, and like it aged, but it didn't like, yeah. So it was like the wine that was like, all right, this is a real thing. And then Desert Island wine. Ew. This is like this answer changes like every week, probably, but the one of the wines that there are two wines that I like buy buy every year. One of them is Clos Cipolle Cuvée de Vignettes, which is a rosé that's like a little bit more, aged under 4. I'm one of the few people who probably has a vertical of rosé in their cellar. But because the wine ages really well, and it's always really fun to pour old rosé for people. But the other one that I feel like I should shout out is Edie Keber, is in the Collio, like literally 200 yards from the Slovenian border, and he makes one white wine called, it's just Collio Bianco. And his son Christian's making the wines now, and it's mostly Friulano, a little bit of Ribolla and Malvasia, and that wine is just really special and super underpriced, and ages brilliantly. So that's it.
Edie Keber was my favorite wine that I tasted when I was in Fruity.
Awesome.
Last summer. Yeah. It's incredible. Okay, cool. Well, at this time, I don't want to. Sorry, Solly, were you going to say something?
Oh, I just said also they've got a grade A winery dog. It's pretty good. Anyway, sorry, I'm derailing the conversation.
Oh, good. Well, I don't want to hog up all the time for questions. If anyone out there have any questions for Saul about the wine or winery or anything else we want over, as well as there's some questions in the chat box, I suppose, that I can pull out. But go ahead. There's a question from Ryan. It says, would you consider yourself a horticulturist as well as a winemaker? It sounds like you almost have to be to figure out what you want and pick the right fruit and almost make it affordable.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Tasting grapes is a thing that is like its own totally unique skill set, and is probably exceptionally important in terms of being a good winemaker, and is not quite unteachable, but it is hilariously hard and different to do when you're on your own. And it's one of those things. It's funny, like when you work for other people, like one of your jobs is like a harvest intern, is to like drive around and sample grapes from different vineyards, and you're trying to pick stuff randomly to kind of taste it and figure out whether or not they're ready to come in. And when you're tasting like with a winemaker, you'll taste it and you're like, I think it's pretty good, or I think it's too tart, or whatever. And then the winemaker will make a pronouncement like, oh, it's ready, or oh no, it's still too green, or whatever, it needs more time. And then you of course go, oh yes, of course, it's too green, it needs more time, or oh yeah, it's definitely ready. And then the first time you do it on your own, it's just like, oh my God, I had opinions before, and is this fruit correct? Like, and really you're tasting the balance between the brightness, the tartness of the grapes, and the sugar content of the grapes, and then also kind of the how green versus sort of fruit tasting the flavors are and everything else. But it's funny, it's not like a horticultural, I mean, there is some horticultural parts, like you're looking at parts of the grape to see like how Like, is the plant starting to shut down for the year? Like, is it are green stems turning into woody stems or things like that? But like, I could teach you that in 15 minutes walking a vineyard. But it is, and it's weird because like, think grapes that taste good don't always taste good as wine. And sometimes, I don't know, but it's hard because you're like, if you pick it too early, you don't want to make wines that are too shrill. It's a weird thing to try to learn. And also you have a whole year in between the exercise to forget whatever it is that you have, you've done. I don't know if that actually answers the question or not.
I don't know. Does it, Ryan?
Yes, as far as that question goes, yes, I'm dealing with the lighting issue. So
No worries.
All good.
Where'd the name come from?
Which so the name Championship Bottle is named after, so in the book / movie High Fidelity, the record store is called Championship Bottle.
This
Oh.
bottle itself, yeah.
So the wine comes from a song by the Hold Steady called Massive Nights. So they are most all the wine names are musical references and song references in one way or another. There is a playlist I can send out that is a history of Championship Bottle by label name songs.
Yes.
That Jeffrey, my DC distributor, basically forced me to put together, so he didn't have to explain it to all of his customers. But yeah, I'll pass it along.
Yeah, I love that. Also, what's the story? I forgot to ask. What's the story with this label?
Oh, I mean, I have a really talented friend, DC area graphic design, not legend, but should be a legend, Mike Van Hall. And so met Mike when I was working for Green Hat, and he was just starting his work as a graphic designer. At the time, he was like taking on, he was responsible for Stillwater's big redesign of all their beer labels, and he does all Aslan stuff locally, and has done some work for DC Brown and a bunch of other things. I am one of just 2 wine clients, I think. Anyway, but I was his first winery. But it was one of those, I always liked his graphical sensibilities, and I basically give him the wine name without any context, and a description of what the wine's going to be like, and mostly just stay out of the way. And
Wait, when you say description of the wine, are you talking about like flavor, the feel,
Yeah.
or are you talking about like what the wine is, like what technical side of it?
More how the wine tastes. It'll be
Okay.
like, okay, yeah, like, hey, the Lusty Little Crushes, it's bright and kind of juicy and fresh, and it's red, but it's barely red, and it's, maybe, I'll tell them the grapes, and like, these are the things that need to be on the label for legal purposes. And then basically he'll send me back a couple options. Generally, it's funny. He claims it's not true, but there's always like one terrible design that I'm like, all right, you really just want this one, and you made the other one just so I'll have the illusion. It's not terrible, but it's like really out there or something like that, where I'm just like, we're not releasing a wine with an all tan label, and true story, tan on tan on tan. I was like, you asshole.
Love it.
But yeah, and I try to stay out of his way, and I think the results are fun, and I don't know, I didn't want to just be another picture of a house on black ink house on a white label, and it's always interesting to know whether or not people will take the wine seriously if the labels aren't, but knock on wood, things are going okay. So
I think that's a discussion that can go on, like whole separate discussion we can have, the label design and its influence on the wine and its perception. But I personally love this label. I think it's actually very befitting to the wine.
Yeah,
that's
cool.
was the name decided because you can fall in love with it for multiple different reasons and they're short-lived, or to the conversation, it sounds like it can go in so many ways. We ate it in a completely different way than what you made it to eat. It was equally
I mean,
tasty. So I just wanted
the wine names, it's funny, there's like a note on my phone that's just like a list of potential wine names where like I'll hear something in the song and be like, oh, that phrase or that word would be fun. And there's a lot of them. And and at some point then we've made a wine and you go, okay, that wine fits this label, or that name fits. And this was one of those wines where like we made it and I'm like, oh man, Lusty Little Crushes. It's just like kind of a little flirtatious. It's like a little, uh and yeah, so we kind of went from there. But the goal is like, I don't want, hopefully they're not like completely obvious. I think it's a little bit more fun if there is room for debate.
Definitely fun, but I feel like the meaning behind it is actually really true, and in a sense where you can fall in love with this wine for a particular pairing session and then realize later that, oh shit, it's better when I do it this way. You know what I mean? So it like it has that quality. And so I feel like that you picked the right name for it. That's what I was asking.
Awesome. I appreciate it. It really,
Just also, I know a lot of people have signed off already, and maybe this is an inappropriate thing to do in front of the winemaker, but how many of you guys actually like this wine?
You can be honest. I promise. Yeah. If you don't like the wine, I am not. Winemakers who have their ego wrapped up in their work are just miserable people. Both from an interaction and also they tend to be really miserable in their lives. So we divorced that really early on.
I'm gonna send you my case club order as soon as I get off this call.
Well, this won't come on until next month, but yes, yeah, I mean, I figure you're one of those people who actually like to hear people's opinion of the wine, whether they like it or not, So that's why I was asking. I felt safe asking that. Maybe I assumed it too much, but
no, you should. I mean, it's really, I mean, funny is maybe the wrong word, but it's really annoying. Sometimes when you make wine, it's really hard to get honest feedback. People are like, oh, it's great. And then you're like, especially, I'm just going to throw your professional class under the bus. Sommeliers are really bad about this, where people are like, because like the day-to-day of winemaker is like you pour samples at all these places and you hope they buy your wine, right? And sommeliers are terrible at being like, oh, I really love it. I really love it. And then you're like, oh, I can't buy it this week. And you're like, all right, cool, no problem.
Yeah.
Like, and then you email them a week later and they're like, oh, pushing it off again and pushing it off. And then like 3 weeks after that, they're like, actually, I didn't really love it that much. And you're like, you could have just told me up front. Yeah. Anyway. But people are always afraid to hurt your feelings. And I don't know, like it's, I don't think winemaking is like, to me, like cooking or like, something more like in a craft or a trade than it is like art. I feel like if I made movies or if I made music, maybe I would feel differently, but it's ultimately like, does this thing give you pleasure? If not, like you're misaligned with the wine and that's fine.
Well, I would just say, so you suggested the preparation to be chill it like a white wine and then take it out. And I think, Saul, when you came on, you said you sort of drink it like as if it were a red wine. So you didn't really, like, you might put a chill on it, but you wouldn't necessarily serve it chilled. So I'm just curious, sort of like, when you had said like you're interested in seeing how it, opens up over time. I did chill it, and I actually sort of liked it better cold, only because it like I don't know, like it's a more refreshing type wine. So I like the tannin on it, but I liked the chill. So I'm just curious. We didn't really go into it, but I'd love to like sort of unpack that a bit.
Oh God. I mean, temperature, it's funny, like temperature can make such a big difference with wine. I shouldn't say like, I try to drink it at 55-ish, like not warm, like not room temperature, but like cool. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that's probably a question of taste. Like when generally with wine, and the cooler it is, you lose maybe a little bit of a little bit of nuance, but also it's more refreshing. I think this is also it, and this might be like winemaker brain talking though too, because like I think I have friends who work in the coffee industry, and the way they drink coffee is like radically different than the way I drink coffee. And they are like very technically oriented tasters a lot of times, and like I don't know if any of you have been to like a freaking coffee cupping tasting or whatever and slurped coffee off of spoons, but like I do not drink my coffee with a spoon. And it turns out that like and ditto with the wine, like if it's more delicious to you chill, like I might be more interested in the technical aspects of it, and you're like, all right, I get a better sort of sense of the wine when it's warmer. And it's entirely possible, and maybe I'll posit that like for me the intellectual understanding of the wine might be slightly more important than, not in general, but like in a sort of relative balance perspective. Like I might value that a little bit more highly than you versus its refreshingness and deliciousness. Like if you're like, all right, you can sacrifice a little bit more delicious, like you can sacrifice deliciousness and it becomes then more you have a sort of more complete understanding of what this thing is, I'll probably take that. Which is kind of a weird choice now that I say it out loud. But I would say like, yes, please give me the less delicious thing. But I would say that might be part of it. Like when you describe it as being more refreshing when it's chilled, and that makes a ton of sense as being true. And it just might not be a trade-off that like winemaker brain me can make.
All right, so let me defend my position here for a second. It's not first and foremost, what Saul said is completely true. I mean, I think, and obviously because the format we're having today, we have a much of a kind of a deeper conversation or discussion about kind of things I want to talk about this month, which is really about, like what is a right way? Is there a right way to do things or whatnot? But particularly with things like this, I don't think there is, because for example, like this, I actually served this wine much warmer at room temperature at Wine Prom, and it was delicious. I liked it for what it was. It went with it well with the food, and then I tried it chilled later, and then it was two complete different experiences. Like it was actually fascinating how different this wine was at cooler temperature as well as a warmer temperature. But they also, like, certain wines just don't work very well. Like in terms of what you're talking about, like technical tasting. I like to taste white wines warm because I think it's a lot harder to hide flaws. When it's a lot easier to point out flaws, so like they detect flaws in the wine when you taste it. So when I'm like tasting it for professional reasons, whether it be trying to put something on the wine list one night, like I have to taste it warm to just see really what's going on, kind of what you were talking about, that kind of like technical dissection of the wine and intellectual understanding of what's happening. I do all of that. But here with this wine, both at colder temperature, cooler temperature, as well as a warmer temperature, I thought the wines worked really well, depending, it just depends on kind of what you were looking for, because it's exactly what the wine is made for. Like it ranges. Its range is so wide that it can do both of that. And the reason I like it starting out with a cold is that you can taste it as a cold, taste it throughout the tasting as it warms up, so you can experience how the wine changes as it warms up, as opposed to if you started out at a warmer temperature, obviously we can't go back cold unless you're putting it on ice or something. So that was kind of like my thinking behind it. It's like, so you can kind of experience that range.
That makes 100% sense. And for the record, like, I'm like, oh, I'd serve it at cellar temperature, whatever. If I'm home, like in Richmond, and it's July, that wine is like and we're drinking red wine. It's like this, and it's fridge cold, and it's like, all right, give it. I don't care at that point. If it's hot, you're like, the intellectual understanding be damned.
All right.
I
think it just really great wine. I think Saul, you made a really great wine, and it has depth and can be enjoyed at all temperatures, but it's different. Because I would say now that I'm at the end of the meal, I want something completely different to eat now than what I started with before.
Yeah.
And I think that that's exceptional. And I like I said to Woong, when when Wine Box comes out, I'll be getting some because it has range, but it's great at all of those ranges. So that is just different. So
I'm glad you like it. I'm flattered. Yeah, it's you know, and side note, I'm probably gonna have to run in a second. But if any of you have questions about anything, obviously, like I'm a pretty open book in terms of winemaking and in terms of the process, and shoot me an email, shoot me a text, whatever. And always happy to chat about the bottles or the winery or whatever.
Oh wait, Saul, I completely shit the bed as a facilitator. I meant to ask you this question before people logged off, which is what's the best way to like stay updated with what you're up to, what championship bottle is up to, what's the best way for us to like reach out to you if you have some questions, like you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, pass along my email. There is an email list on the web that you can sign up for on the website. That I'm bad. I literally write emails for a living professionally and am terrible about writing emails for the winery, but that's a couple times a year, new wines and things like that. And I mean, I'm on Instagram. I'm bad about posting. And yeah, so all of those things.
What's the Instagram handle?
Championship_bottle.
Okay, got it. I will distribute it to folks, but yeah, well, I know there are not a few folks, not as many people left, and I know you have to run, but yeah, I just want to thank you for coming on. I know this is all kind of last minute. We pulled this all together like kind of today, but yeah, I'm really happy that you were able to come on. You were fucking great. You knocked it out of the park, and yeah, thank you for making this delicious wine and giving us the
My
opportunity to
pleasure.
talk
Thanks
here.
for having me. This was a blast. I mean, it's I don't know, it's always fun to wine's a fun thing to talk about, you know?
It is indeed. So thank you, everybody. It is Saul Muchnick
Bye,
of Championship
everyone.
Bottle.
Thanks again. Enjoy the wines.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Saul. Appreciate
Later.
it. All right. We haven't done one of those in a while. We haven't had a guest speaker in a while. Stop the recording.
I